A millionaire insulted his housekeeper to entertain his guests. Her unexpected response left the entire gathering in silence. The Sinclair mansion stood as a monument to excess, its towering columns and sprawling gardens a visible declaration of wealth and influence. Tonight, the estate was alive with activity. Strings of lights adorned the trees lining the driveway, and the sound of soft piano music floated through the night air. Guests arrived in sleek cars, stepping onto the cobblestone path where uniformed attendants greeted them with polished efficiency. Inside, the grand dining hall shimmered under the glow of crystal chandeliers, their brilliance reflected in the polished floors and gilded mirrors. The room was a spectacle of luxury. Deep mahogany tables set with fine china, floral centerpieces cascading with exotic blooms, and servers gliding between the clusters of elegantly dressed guests with trays of champagne. At the center of it all stood Robert Sinclair, a man whose charm and presence dominated the space as effortlessly as the chandeliers dominated the ceiling. Dressed in a tailored navy suit with a pocket square that seemed chosen solely to match the sapphire glint of his cufflinks, Robert moved through the crowd like a monarch surveying his kingdom. "Ah, Geoffrey, you old scoundrel!" Robert greeted one of the guests with a hearty laugh, clapping the man on the back. "Still managing to outpace the market, are you?" "Only by following your example," Geoffrey replied, raising his glass in mock homage. As the two men exchanged pleasantries, the guests around them listened with practiced interest, laughing at Robert's quips and nodding at his anecdotes. He thrived in this environment, where every glance, laugh, and word reaffirmed his position at the top of the social hierarchy. And tonight, the stakes were higher than usual. Several influential figures had accepted his invitation, individuals whose favor Robert needed to secure a lucrative deal that had been eluding him for months. At the far edge of the room, nearly invisible among the grandeur, moved Grace. Her black uniform blended into the dark paneling of the walls, and her soft-soled shoes made her movements nearly silent. She carried herself with a quiet dignity that seemed to go unnoticed by most of the guests, but not by Robert. Her role in the Sinclair household had evolved over the years, from a simple housekeeper to someone who could anticipate Robert's needs before he voiced them. It was a role she performed with precision and grace, though without fanfare or gratitude. "Grace," Robert's voice rang out, sharp but tinged with a performative warmth. Heads turned toward her as if drawn by an invisible string. Grace paused mid-step, the tray of champagne flutes in her hands perfectly balanced. "Yes, Mr. Sinclair," she replied, her tone measured. "Could you fetch another bottle of the Margaux from the cellar? You know the one, the 96. Nothing but the best for our guests, right?" His tone held a lilt of amusement, as if he were sharing a private joke at her expense. "Of course, sir," Grace replied, her expression betraying nothing. She turned and left the room with the same quiet efficiency she had entered, but not before the moment had drawn the attention of the room. A ripple of murmurs followed in her wake, polite and superficial. "She's quite the professional," one guest remarked, their tone a mixture of admiration and condescension. Robert chuckled. "Oh, Grace has been with me for years. Knows this house better than I do, I suspect. Or at least, better than my ex-wife ever did." The comment drew laughter, though it felt hollow, a brittle sound that failed to mask the discomfort it stirred. Robert's sharp wit was part of his charm, but it often skirted the edge of cruelty. Tonight, he seemed intent on pushing that edge further. When Grace returned with the bottle, Robert greeted her with a theatrical clap of his hands. "There she is, the savior of the evening." He gestured grandly toward the table. "Go on, Grace. Let's hear you tell the guests about this wine. You're practically an expert by now, aren't you?" Grace's hand tightened around the neck of the bottle for the briefest of moments before she stepped forward. Her voice, steady and calm, filled the room. The Chateau Margaux 1996 is considered one of the finest vintages of its era. It's noted for its balance and complexity, with flavors of blackcurrant, cedar, and a hint of violet. Her knowledge caught the guests off guard. A few exchanged glances, murmuring their approval. But Robert, not one to let someone else command the spotlight for long, waved a hand dismissively. "Well done, Grace," he said, his smile not reaching his eyes. I'm sure you could write a book with everything you've learned here. Perhaps a memoir? Life Below Stairs. A Housekeeper's Tales. What do you think? The laughter that followed was hesitant, uncertain. Grace's face remained composed, but a faint flicker of something, hurt, perhaps, or defiance, flashed in her eyes. She placed the bottle on the table and stepped back, her posture immaculate. The evening wore on, but the undercurrent of tension lingered. Robert's jokes grew sharper, his tone more pointed, as if he were testing the limits of how far he could push. Grace continued her duties with unflinching professionalism, her presence a quiet counterpoint to the excess and arrogance around her. By the time dessert was served, the guests were more subdued, their earlier laughter replaced by thoughtful murmurs. Grace moved through the room like a shadow, her expression unreadable but her actions deliberate. When she caught Robert's eye from across the room, he held her gaze for a moment longer than necessary. There was something in her look that unsettled him, though he couldn't place why. Finally, as the last plates were cleared and the guests began to disperse, Robert raised his glass one final time. To the finer things in life, he declared, his voice booming, and to those who remind us just how fortunate we are. His words hung in the air, their weight amplified by the heavy silence that followed. Grace, standing at the back of the room, met his gaze with a calm intensity that seemed to strip the moment of its intended triumph. It was a quiet challenge, one that only Robert truly understood. As the guests filtered out into the night, their murmurs carried a mix of admiration and unease. They had come expecting an evening of opulence and charm, but they left with the sense that something deeper, something unresolved, had taken root in the gilded halls of the Sinclair mansion. And for Robert, who stood watching Grace as she disappeared into the shadows, the night was far from over. A sense of unease crept into his chest, uninvited and unfamiliar. For the first time in years, he felt as if he were no longer the one in control. The next morning, sunlight poured through the tall windows of the Sinclair mansion, gilding the marble floors and casting long, angular shadows across the room. The aftermath of the dinner party lingered, half-empty glasses on side tables, the faint scent of cigars clinging to the air, and the telltale quiet of a house recovering from a late night. Yet, despite the calm exterior, a storm was brewing just beneath the surface. Robert Sinclair sat in the dining room, his hand resting on a steaming cup of coffee. The newspaper in front of him lay untouched, its bold headlines failing to capture his attention. His mind was still on the evening before. The subtle tension in the air, the way Grace had met his barbs with an unshakable calm. It gnawed at him, the thought that she had walked away from the night untouched by his jabs. He had expected a reaction, a flinch, something. Instead, she had given him nothing. His reverie was broken by the quiet sound of footsteps. Grace entered the room, her black uniform crisp, her hair pulled back neatly. She moved with the same quiet efficiency as always, but something about her presence seemed sharper today, more deliberate. "Good morning, Mr. Sinclair," she said, her tone polite but cool. She began clearing the remnants of his breakfast tray, her movements precise. "Grace," Robert said, leaning back in his chair, "you've certainly kept yourself busy this morning. It's almost as if last night didn't happen." She glanced at him briefly, her expression neutral. "There's always work to be done, sir." The simplicity of her response grated on him. He set his cup down with a soft clink, his gaze fixed on her. "You were quite the topic of conversation last night, you know. The guests were impressed by your poise. Some of them even thought you might have been too poised. A bit unnatural, perhaps?" Grace paused, her hands steady as she adjusted the tray. "It's kind of you to say so, Mr. Sinclair. I'm sure they were simply being polite." "Polite," he repeated, leaning forward slightly. His smile was thin, almost predatory. "Yes, polite. But you and I both know that polite can mean so many things, don't we?" The words hung in the air like a challenge. Grace met his gaze, her expression unchanging. "If there's something you'd like to say, sir, I'd prefer you say it plainly." For a moment, Robert was caught off guard. He hadn't expected her to push back, even in such a measured way. His smile faltered, but only briefly. "Oh, no need for dramatics, Grace. I was merely reflecting on how much we take for granted in this house. You, for example. Your diligence, your ability to keep things running smoothly. It's commendable. Thank you, sir, Grace replied, though her tone lacked warmth. She continued clearing the table, her movements unhurried. Robert watched her for a moment longer, his mind working. He couldn't quite pinpoint why, but the usual satisfaction he felt in asserting his authority wasn't there. Grace's unflappable demeanor irritated him, her composure acting as a mirror to his own insecurities. The more he tried to needle her, the more it felt like he was losing ground. Tell me, Robert said, leaning back in his chair again, do you enjoy working here? Or is it simply a means to an end? Grace straightened, the tray balanced expertly in her hands. I take pride in my work, sir. I always have, even when it involves entertaining the whims of the guests. His voice carried a hint of mockery, his smile widening as if daring her to react. She held his gaze for a long moment, her expression unreadable. I believe a housekeeper's role is to maintain the dignity of the household, sir, even when others do not. The words were delivered calmly, but they struck with the precision of a blade. Robert's smile faltered, a flicker of surprise crossing his face before he quickly masked it. Grace, however, had already turned away, the tray in her hands as steady as her voice. As she exited the room, Robert sat back in his chair, the silence pressing in around him. For the first time in years, he felt as though he were on the receiving end of someone else's control. It was an unsettling realization, one that left him both intrigued and unnerved. The tension between them simmered throughout the day, bubbling just below the surface. Robert found himself seeking out reasons to cross paths with Grace, each interaction another attempt to reclaim the upper hand. But each time, she met his provocations with the same quiet resilience, her responses measured and precise. By late afternoon, the air between them had grown thick with unspoken words. Grace was in the drawing room, polishing the antique silver candlesticks when Robert entered, his hands in his pockets. You're quite the enigma, Grace, he said, his tone casual but probing. One moment you're the picture of servitude, and the next, you're schooling me in my own house. I can't decide whether to be impressed or offended. Grace didn't look up from her work. Perhaps neither is necessary, sir. Oh, but it is, Robert replied, stepping closer. You see, I pride myself on understanding the people in my life. And yet, here you are, always just out of reach. Tell me, Grace, what's your secret? She set the candlestick down carefully, finally meeting his gaze. The only secret, Mr. Sinclair, is that I know my place. Do you? The question hung in the air, heavy and unanswerable. Robert stared at her, his usual confidence slipping as he searched for a response. But Grace had already returned to her work, her composure unshaken. For the first time, Robert felt a hint of fear creeping in, a fear not of losing control, but of realizing he may never have truly had it in the first place. The Sinclair mansion was quiet, the kind of quiet that felt unnatural, heavy with unspoken words and lingering tension. Grace moved through the halls with the same steady rhythm she had perfected over years of service, her footsteps soft against the polished floors. Yet, behind her composed exterior, a storm brewed. The dinner party had been a spectacle of opulence and power, but its aftermath had left Grace in a state of quiet reflection. She thought of Robert's words, his attempts to diminish her dignity under the guise of humor, the laughter of his guests echoing like a faint hum in the back of her mind. It wasn't the first time she had endured his jabs, nor would it likely be the last. But something about this particular evening felt different, as though a line had been crossed. In the early hours of the morning, Grace found herself standing in the kitchen, staring out of the small window above the sink. The garden was bathed in moonlight, the neatly trimmed hedges casting long, uneven shadows across the lawn. She had spent years ensuring that every inch of this house reflected the perfection Robert demanded, and yet, she wondered, did he ever truly see her? Did any of them? Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of approaching footsteps. She turned to see Maggie, one of the younger maids, entering the kitchen, her eyes wide with curiosity. Grace, Maggie said hesitantly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Are you all right? I noticed you stayed late tonight." Grace offered a small smile, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "Just tidying up. You know how these events leave the house." Maggie nodded, but her gaze lingered. "He was harsh tonight. Mr. Sinclair, I mean. I heard some of the things he said." Grace's smile tightened. "It's not the first time, Maggie. It won't be the last." "But it's not right," Maggie said, her youthful indignation bubbling to the surface. "You don't deserve to be treated like that." Grace sighed, her expression softening as she looked at the younger woman. "Maggie, in this world, fairness is a luxury. We do our jobs, we keep our heads down, and we carry on." "But what if—" "Maggie," Grace interrupted gently but firmly, "let it be." The words hung in the air, and Maggie nodded reluctantly, retreating with a small, "Good night, Grace." As the kitchen doors swung shut behind her, Grace turned back to the window, her reflection barely visible against the darkness outside. She clenched her hands on the counter, the cool marble grounding her as she steadied her breathing. The next morning, Grace was up before dawn, her routine as precise as ever. She moved through the house, setting everything in order, her thoughts focused on the tasks at hand. Yet, the weight of the previous night lingered, a quiet tension that she carried like an invisible burden. As she entered the dining room to prepare for breakfast, she was met with Robert's presence. He sat at the head of the table, his coffee untouched, his eyes scanning the morning newspaper. The room was bathed in soft sunlight, the golden hues highlighting the sharp angles of his face. "Good morning, Grace," he said, his tone measured. There was a flicker of something in his gaze. Curiosity, perhaps, or a hint of unease. "Good morning, Mr. Sinclair," she replied, her voice even. Robert set the paper down and leaned back in his chair, studying her. "You seem particularly stoic this morning. Not that it's unusual for you, of course." Always the picture of composure. Grace met his gaze, her expression calm. "I aim to perform my duties to the best of my ability, sir." "Ah, yes, duty," Robert said, a faint smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. "You've always been exceptional at that. But tell me, Grace, do you ever tire of it? This relentless perfection?" Grace hesitated for a fraction of a second before replying. "I find satisfaction in my work, sir. It gives me purpose." "Purpose," Robert repeated, the word rolling off his tongue as if he were tasting it. "A noble sentiment, to be sure. But I wonder, does it ever feel limiting? Serving others, day in and day out." Grace's eyes flickered with something, a brief flash of defiance, but her voice remained steady. "We all serve in our own ways, Mr. Sinclair. Even you." The words were soft, but they carried a weight that seemed to land heavily between them. Robert's smirk faltered, and he leaned forward slightly, his elbows resting on the table. "Is that so?" he asked, his tone laced with curiosity. "It is," Grace replied simply. "You serve your guests, your investors, your reputation. We all serve something." For a moment, silence filled the room, the tension palpable. Then Robert chuckled, the sound low and measured. "You have a way with words, Grace. Perhaps I've underestimated you." Grace inclined her head slightly but said nothing. She turned to leave the room, her movements deliberate, her composure intact. As she exited, Robert watched her, his expression unreadable. The day continued with the usual rhythm of the household, but the undercurrent of tension remained. By evening, Robert found himself pacing his study, a glass of whiskey in hand. His mind kept drifting back to Grace, her calm defiance, the quiet strength in her words. It unsettled him in a way he couldn't quite articulate. He replayed the dinner party in his mind, the subtle ways she had maintained her dignity despite his attempts to undermine her. He thought of her words that morning, the pointed truth she had delivered without a hint of malice. For the first time, Robert began to wonder if he had been the one miscalculating, if his need to assert control had blinded him to something more profound. Meanwhile, Grace stood in her small quarters, the evening light casting long shadows across the room. She stared at the letter in her hand, the one she had received days ago but hadn't yet acted upon. It was an invitation, a chance to leave the Sinclair household and start anew. The thought filled her with a mix of fear and hope, the possibilities stretching out before her like an uncharted path. As the night deepened, both Grace and Robert found themselves staring out into the darkness, their thoughts heavy with the weight of unspoken truths. The storm that had been brewing between them was far from over, and when it finally broke, it would leave neither of them untouched. The day began with the faint hum of life, waking within the Sinclair mansion. Grace moved through the grand halls as she had for years, her movements deliberate, her focus unwavering. The staff greeted her with quiet nods as they prepared for the day ahead, their respect for her evident in the small courtesies they extended. To them, she wasn't merely a housekeeper. She was the linchpin that kept the Sinclair household running seamlessly. But as Grace stepped into the solarium to oversee its cleaning, her thoughts drifted to the past, a past she seldom allowed herself to revisit. The room, with its walls of glass and sunlight streaming through in golden shafts, had always been a favorite of hers. It was here, years ago, that she had first spoken with Eleanor Sinclair, Robert's late wife. Eleanor had been a force of nature, elegant, intelligent, and unflinchingly kind. Grace remembered their first conversation vividly. She had been polishing the silver when Eleanor entered, her presence so magnetic that Grace had momentarily frozen in her task. "You don't have to stand like a statue, you know," Eleanor had said, her voice light with humor. "I don't bite." Grace had smiled hesitantly, unsure of how to respond. Eleanor sat down across from her, her gaze warm but piercing. "You're new here, aren't you?" "Yes, ma'am," Grace replied softly. "Just a few weeks." "I can tell," Eleanor said, leaning forward slightly. "You move like someone who's afraid to leave a mark." "Don't be. This house could use more people like you." The words had stayed with Grace. In a household defined by power and appearances, Eleanor had been a rare source of genuine kindness. She had taken Grace under her wing, teaching her the unspoken rules of the Sinclair world while ensuring she never lost her sense of self. The solarium felt emptier without Eleanor's presence, but Grace carried the memory of her like a steadying force. It was Eleanor who had taught her to endure Robert's moods, his sharp words, and his relentless need for control. "He's a good man underneath it all," Eleanor had once said, "but he's lost Grace. Don't let him take you down with him." Grace often wondered if that goodness still existed. She had seen glimpses of it in the rare moments when Robert let his guard down, but those moments were fleeting, buried beneath layers of arrogance and insecurity. Later that afternoon, as Grace organized the library, her past came rushing back again. The Sinclair mansion hadn't always been her refuge. Years earlier, she had struggled to keep her family afloat after her father's sudden illness. The medical bills had been crushing, forcing Grace to take on multiple jobs just to make ends meet. It was during one of those desperate years that she had found herself at the Sinclair estate, a young woman with little to her name but an unyielding determination to survive. Her initial days at the mansion had been grueling. The staff was wary of newcomers, and Robert's exacting standards left no room for error. But Grace had proven herself quickly, her attention to detail and quiet resilience earning her a place of respect among the household. Eleanor had noticed her potential early on, and under her mentorship, Grace had risen from a nervous, maid-to-the-housekeeper who could anticipate the needs of the household before they were spoken. Yet, despite her position, she never forgot the struggles that had brought her here. They remained etched into her memory, a reminder of the life she had fought to escape. As evening approached, Grace found herself in the small garden just beyond the kitchen. It was a place she often retreated to when the weight of the day felt particularly heavy. The rows of herbs and flowers were a stark contrast to the grandeur of the estate, their simplicity a quiet balm to her restless mind. Maggie joined her, carrying 2 cups of tea. "Thought you could use this," she said, handing one to Grace. "Thank you," Grace replied, taking the cup with a small nod of appreciation. They sat in companionable silence for a while, the sounds of the estate muffled by the garden's hedges. Finally, Maggie spoke. "Have you ever thought about leaving, Grace? Finding something else?" Grace glanced at her, the question lingering in the air. "I've thought about it," she admitted. "But leaving isn't as simple as it sounds." "Why not?" Maggie pressed, her tone curious but not pushy. You're smart, capable. You could do anything. Grace smiled faintly. Perhaps. But this place, it's not just a job. It's a part of me. And leaving would mean leaving everything I've built here. Maggie frowned, her youthful idealism evident in her expression. But doesn't staying mean putting up with him? Grace's smile faded slightly, her gaze turning thoughtful. Robert Sinclair is many things, Maggie. But he's not my reason for staying. Maggie tilted her head, puzzled. Then what is? Grace didn't answer immediately. Instead, she looked out at the garden, her thoughts far away. Finally, she said, sometimes it's not about the place or the people. It's about knowing you made a difference, however small. The conversation stayed with Grace as she returned to the mansion, her thoughts swirling. Maggie's words had touched a nerve, bringing to the surface the doubts Grace had worked so hard to suppress. She had always told herself that her role in the Sinclair household mattered, that her presence brought order and stability to a place often teetering on chaos. But was that enough? Did it justify the sacrifices she had made? That night, as she prepared for bed, Grace unfolded the letter she had been carrying for days. It was an offer from an old acquaintance, a position at a respected estate with better pay and less scrutiny. It was everything she had once dreamed of, yet she hesitated. Leaving the Sinclair mansion meant leaving a part of herself behind, a part that had been shaped by years of challenges and quiet victories. She folded the letter carefully and set it aside. The decision could wait, at least for now. Meanwhile, in his study, Robert sat alone, a glass of whiskey in hand. His thoughts, too, drifted to the past, to Eleanor, to the life they had shared, and to the void her absence had left. He thought of Grace, her quiet strength, and the way she had stood her ground against his provocations. It unsettled him, the way she seemed immune to his control. But more than that, it intrigued him. For the first time in years, Robert found himself questioning not just Grace's role in his life, but his own. And as the night deepened, both he and Grace lay awake, their thoughts tangled with the weight of decisions yet to be made. The morning sun spilled into the Sinclair mansion, its warm glow unable to dispel the tension that hung in the air. The house seemed quieter than usual, the typical hum of activity muted. Grace moved through her routine with practiced precision, yet her mind was far from the tasks at hand. The conversation with Maggie the night before had stirred something deep within her, a restless questioning that she couldn't quite shake. By mid-morning, Grace was in the drawing room, arranging fresh flowers in an antique vase. The soft scent of lilies filled the air as she worked, her hands moving deftly, but her thoughts were elsewhere. She didn't notice Robert enter until his voice broke the silence. "Grace," he said, his tone more subdued than usual. She turned to face him, her expression calm but guarded. "Good morning, Mr. Sinclair." Robert leaned against the doorway, his arms crossed over his chest. He studied her for a moment before speaking, his voice carrying an unfamiliar edge of uncertainty. "I've been thinking about our conversation the other day." Grace placed the vase on the table, her hands steady. "Which conversation would that be, sir?" "The one about purpose," he said, his gaze fixed on her. "About serving. It stayed with me." Grace tilted her head slightly, her expression unreadable. "I didn't realize it had made such an impression." Robert's lips quirked in a faint, humorless smile. "Neither did I." He paused, as if searching for the right words. "You have a way of saying things that linger." Grace didn't respond immediately. Instead, she met his gaze, her silence a quiet challenge. Finally, she said, "Perhaps that's because they're true." The air between them seemed to thicken, the unspoken tension stretching taut. Robert pushed off the doorway and stepped further into the room, his movements deliberate. "You're not like anyone else I've ever worked with, Grace." "I would hope not," she replied, her tone even. He chuckled softly, but there was no humor in the sound. "You always have an answer, don't you?" "Only when there's a question worth answering," she said, turning her attention back to the flowers. The rest of the morning unfolded uneventfully, but the undercurrent of tension remained. It wasn't until lunch that the atmosphere began to shift. Robert had invited a small group of associates to the mansion, a business meeting disguised as a casual gathering. The dining room was set impeccably, and the air buzzed with the polite chatter of men discussing stocks, mergers, and market trends. Grace entered the room carrying a tray of coffee, her movements as smooth as ever. She served each guest with quiet efficiency, her presence almost unnoticed until Robert addressed her. "Grace," he said, his tone casual but calculated. "You've always had a knack for timing. Tell me, do you think that's something one can learn? Or is it just innate?" She paused briefly, her gaze meeting his. The question was laced with condescension, a thinly veiled attempt to remind her of her place. But instead of faltering, Grace answered with a faint smile. "Timing is a skill, sir," she said, her voice steady. "One that's honed through observation and understanding." Robert raised an eyebrow, intrigued despite himself. "Observation and understanding. Interesting. And what have you observed about timing, Grace?" "That it's often less about the moment itself and more about the preparation leading up to it," she replied, setting the tray down on the table. The guests chuckled politely, assuming her response was a clever quip, but Robert heard the deeper meaning behind her words. For a brief moment, his confidence wavered, though he quickly masked it with a smirk. "Well said," he remarked, lifting his coffee cup in a mock toast. "Perhaps I should take lessons from you." Grace inclined her head slightly, her expression calm. "Perhaps you should." The afternoon wore on, the meeting progressing with the usual ebb and flow of conversation. But Robert's mind remained distracted, his thoughts circling back to Grace's words. There was something disarming about her ability to hold her ground, to meet his challenges without flinching. It both unsettled and intrigued him. By early evening, the guests had left, and the mansion was quiet once more. Robert found himself in the study, a glass of whiskey in hand, staring out the window at the sprawling gardens. His mind replayed the events of the day, his interactions with Grace standing out like bright threads in a tapestry. She had a way of turning his own words against him, of holding up a mirror that reflected not just his power but also his flaws. It was a skill he hadn't encountered often, and it left him feeling both vulnerable and curious. Meanwhile, Grace was in her quarters, the letter from her acquaintance once again in her hands. She read it for the third time, her thoughts swirling. The offer was tempting, a chance to leave behind the weight of the Sinclair household and start fresh. But the decision wasn't as simple as it seemed. Her mind drifted to Eleanor's words, spoken years ago in the solarium. "This house is a test, Grace. It will shape you, for better or worse. But the choice of how it shapes you is yours." Eleanor had believed in her, had seen potential in her that Grace hadn't yet recognized in herself. Leaving the Sinclair mansion would mean walking away from that legacy, from the lessons she had learned and the strength she had built. But staying meant continuing to endure Robert's provocations, his relentless need to assert control. As the evening deepened, Grace folded the letter carefully and set it aside. She would make her decision soon, but tonight wasn't the night. The mansion settled into its nighttime rhythm, the quiet broken only by the occasional creak of floorboards or the distant hum of the staff wrapping up their duties. Robert remained in the study, the fire casting flickering shadows on the walls. He stared into the flames, his thoughts heavy with unspoken questions. For the first time in years, Robert felt as though the ground beneath him was shifting. Grace had become more than just a housekeeper in his eyes. She was a force he couldn't quite define, one that both challenged and unsettled him. And as he sat there, the glass of whiskey forgotten in his hand, he realized that the game between them had changed. He just didn't know how, or who would emerge victorious. The Sinclair mansion was quiet, wrapped in the peculiar stillness that often followed moments of tension. Grace moved through the house as she always did, her movements precise, her presence understated. But inside, her thoughts churned, brimming with questions and possibilities. The events of the past few days had left her unsettled, the weight of unspoken truths pressing heavily on her chest. By late morning, the calm was disrupted by an unexpected visitor. Robert's business rival, Lawrence Cartwright, arrived at the estate, his polished demeanor masking the sharp edge of his intentions. Grace watched discreetly as Robert greeted him in the grand foyer, the two men exchanging pleasantries laced with subtle barbs. "Cartwright," Robert said, extending a hand with a practiced smile. To what do I owe the pleasure? Lawrence returned the handshake, his grip firm. I thought it was time we had a chat. It seems we've been circling the same waters for a while now. Robert's smile tightened, his eyes narrowing slightly. And you decided my home was the best place for this chat? Lawrence chuckled, the sound devoid of warmth. Your office seemed too formal. Besides, I was curious to see the infamous Sinclair estate for myself. The air between them crackled with unspoken rivalry, each man measuring the other's words. Grace slipped away, her presence unnoticed, but her mind racing. Lawrence's visit was unusual, and the tension it carried hinted at something more significant than mere business. Grace returned to the kitchen, where Maggie was arranging fresh produce. The younger woman glanced up, her curiosity evident. Who's the suit? Lawrence Cartwright, Grace replied, her tone neutral. A business associate of Mr. Sinclair's. Associate? Maggie raised an eyebrow. He didn't look like an associate, more like a shark. Grace allowed herself a faint smile. You're not wrong. Maggie hesitated, then lowered her voice. Do you think he's here to cause trouble? Grace's expression grew thoughtful. With men like Cartwright, trouble is never far behind. The two women continued their work in silence, the tension in the air seeping into their movements. Grace's instincts told her that Lawrence's visit was more than a social call, and her instincts were rarely wrong. The conversation between Robert and Lawrence took place in the study, the heavy oak door closed to ensure privacy. Grace passed by the room several times as she went about her duties, catching fragments of their discussion through the thick wood. The words were muffled, but the tone was unmistakable, low and sharp, like the edge of a blade. Later, as the sun dipped low on the horizon, Lawrence departed, his expression unreadable. Robert watched him leave from the front steps, his posture rigid, his jaw tight. Grace observed from a distance, noting the faint tension in his shoulders, the way his hands clenched into fists at his sides. When Robert finally returned inside, he found Grace in the drawing room, adjusting the arrangement of flowers on the mantel. For a moment, he simply stood in the doorway, watching her with an intensity that made the air feel heavier. You heard, didn't you? He asked finally, his voice low. Grace didn't turn, her hands steady as she adjusted a sprig of lavender. I hear many things, Mr. Sinclair, most of which I choose to ignore. Robert stepped further into the room, his gaze fixed on her. And what do you choose not to ignore? Grace turned to face him, her expression calm but unyielding. The things that matter. His lips pressed into a thin line, and he crossed his arms over his chest. Do you think this house is falling apart, Grace? Do you think I'm losing control? She met his gaze evenly, her voice quiet but firm. I think control is an illusion, sir. And the more you try to hold on to it, the more it slips away. The words struck like a hammer, the truth of them reverberating in the silence that followed. Robert stared at her, his mask of confidence cracking just enough for her to see the uncertainty beneath. That evening, Grace found herself in the library, searching for a book to quiet her restless mind. The dim light cast long shadows across the shelves, and the faint scent of aged paper filled the air. She ran her fingers along the spines, her thoughts wandering. Her solitude was interrupted by Robert's voice. Grace. She turned to find him standing in the doorway, his expression unreadable. He stepped inside, closing the door behind him, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. Finally, he said, I need to ask you something, and I want the truth. Grace arched an eyebrow, her posture composed. I've never been one to lie, Mr. Sinclair. He nodded, his gaze steady. Do you trust me? The question caught her off guard, though her expression didn't betray it. She considered her response carefully before speaking. I trust you to be who you are. And who is that? He pressed, his tone almost challenging. A man who values power and control above all else, she replied, her voice even. But also a man who's capable of more, if he chooses to see it. The silence that followed was heavy, charged with the weight of her words. Robert looked away, his jaw tightening. Cartwright said something today. Something about loyalty. He implied that someone close to me has been feeding him information. Grace's heart skipped a beat, but her expression remained calm. And you think it's me? I don't know what to think, he admitted, his voice quieter now. But you're the only one who's ever been able to challenge me without fear. That makes you different. Grace held his gaze, her voice steady. If I wanted to betray you, Mr. Sinclair, I wouldn't be standing here. The simplicity of her statement left him momentarily speechless. He studied her, searching for any sign of deception, but found none. As the night deepened, Grace returned to her quarters, her mind heavy with the weight of the conversation. Robert's question lingered, the vulnerability behind it unsettling. For all his bravado, he was a man standing on the edge, uncertain of who he could trust. And for the first time, Grace allowed herself to wonder if she might be the one to pull him back, or let him fall. The Sinclair mansion seemed different that morning, as though the air itself carried the weight of something about to unravel. Grace felt it as she moved through the house, her senses attuned to the subtle shifts in the environment. The staff was quieter than usual, their conversations hushed, their movements deliberate. Even the sunlight streaming through the tall windows seemed muted, its warmth failing to dispel the tension that lingered like a storm cloud. In the study, Robert sat at his desk, his hands steepled beneath his chin. His thoughts churned, circling back to Lawrence Cartwright's words the day before. Someone close to him had betrayed his trust, feeding information to his rival. The accusation had been vague, but its implications were clear. The walls of his carefully curated world were closing in, and Robert found himself questioning everything and everyone. He reached for his phone and dialed a number. "Robert Sinclair," he said when the call connected. "I need a full review of the staff's records. Every detail." Discreetly. Meanwhile, Grace moved through her routine with practiced composure, but her mind was far from the tasks at hand. She couldn't ignore the tension that had settled over the house, nor could she forget the look in Robert's eyes during their conversation the night before. He was unraveling, and she wasn't sure whether he would lash out or retreat into himself. She was in the dining room, setting the table for lunch, when Maggie approached her. The younger woman's face was pale, her expression worried. "Grace," Maggie whispered, glancing over her shoulder as though afraid of being overheard. "I think something's happening." Grace paused, her hands steady despite the unease creeping into her chest. "What do you mean?" "I overheard Mr. Sinclair on the phone this morning," Maggie said, her voice low. "He's having the staff investigated. All of us." Grace's grip on the silverware tightened, but she kept her expression calm. "That's not unusual. He's done it before. But this feels different," Maggie insisted. "He's on edge. And I think he suspects you." Grace's chest tightened, though she didn't let it show. "He suspects everyone, Maggie. That's how he operates." Maggie hesitated, then nodded reluctantly. "Just be careful, Grace. Please." By midday, the atmosphere in the mansion had grown even more tense. Robert had confined himself to the study, poring over documents and making calls, while the staff moved through the house with a mix of caution and curiosity. Whispers of his investigation spread quickly, and the sense of unease became palpable. Grace found herself in the kitchen, preparing a tray of tea for Robert. Her movements were methodical, her expression calm, but her mind raced. If Robert was truly investigating the staff, it was only a matter of time before he confronted her directly. And when he did, she would need to be ready. As she carried the tray to the study, her thoughts turned to Eleanor. She had faced Robert's temper countless times, her unyielding kindness a shield against his sharp words. Grace wondered what Eleanor would say if she were here now. Would she tell Grace to stand her ground? Or would she urge her to walk away? When Grace entered the study, Robert looked up from his desk, his expression guarded. "Grace," he said, his tone neutral. "Come in." She set the tray on the table and straightened, meeting his gaze with her usual composure. "Is there something you need, Mr. Sinclair?" Robert leaned back in his chair, studying her for a long moment before speaking. "Do you know what loyalty means, Grace?" She didn't flinch. "It means standing by someone, even when it's difficult." "And do you consider yourself loyal?" he asked, his voice carrying a faint edge. "I do," she replied without hesitation. Robert's gaze hardened. "Then explain this." He slid a document across the desk toward her. Grace glanced at it, her stomach tightening as she recognized the contents. It was an email exchange between an unknown sender and Lawrence Cartwright, detailing information about Robert's business dealings, information that only someone within the household could have accessed. She met his gaze evenly. "What is it you think I've done, Mr. Sinclair?" "You've had access to everything, Grace," he said, his voice rising. "My schedules, my documents, my conversations. And now this turns up. What am I supposed to think?" "That I've spent years serving this household with integrity," she said calmly, "and that I've earned more than baseless accusations." Her words seemed to pierce through his anger, but he wasn't ready to relent. "Then how do you explain this?" he demanded, gesturing to the document. "I can't," she admitted, "because I don't know who's responsible. But I can tell you this. I would never betray this household or you." The conviction in her voice gave him pause. He leaned forward, his elbows on the desk, his expression conflicted. "Then help me, Grace. Help me find out who did." The afternoon passed in a flurry of activity as Grace and Robert began reviewing the staff records together. It was an uneasy alliance, their mutual distrust tempered by a shared determination to uncover the truth. As they worked, Grace noticed the subtle shifts in Robert's demeanor, the cracks in his confidence, the glimpses of vulnerability he rarely allowed anyone to see. By evening, they had narrowed their suspicions to a few key individuals, but no concrete evidence had emerged. Frustration hung in the air as Robert poured himself a drink, his movements tense. "It has to be someone close," he muttered, more to himself than to Grace. "Someone I trusted." Grace watched him silently, her own thoughts swirling. She knew the weight of betrayal, the pain of realizing that those you relied on could turn against you. And as she stood there, she realized that for all his wealth and power, Robert was just as human as anyone else, flawed, vulnerable, and searching for answers. The night deepened, and the mansion grew quiet once more. Robert remained in the study, staring out the window with a drink in hand, while Grace returned to her quarters. The day's events had left her drained, but also resolute. Whatever came next, she would face it with the same quiet strength that had carried her through so many storms before. And as the first stars appeared in the night sky, both Grace and Robert knew that the turning point had arrived. The truth was within reach, but it would demand more of them than either had anticipated. The Sinclair mansion was bathed in the soft glow of early morning, the golden light casting long shadows across its grand halls. For all its opulence, the house felt strangely hollow, as though the tension of the past few days had drained it of its vitality. Grace moved through the quiet space with her usual composure, but her thoughts were anything but calm. The investigation into the betrayal had narrowed its focus, and Grace knew that the truth was close to being uncovered. Robert had summoned her to the study for one final conversation, and though she had faced countless challenges during her years in the household, this felt different. This felt final. Robert was already in the study when Grace arrived, standing by the window with his back to the door. He turned as she entered, his expression grim but not unkind. A small fire crackled in the hearth, its warmth doing little to dispel the tension in the room. "Grace," he said, gesturing for her to take a seat. "Thank you for coming." She nodded and sat down, her posture straight, her hands resting lightly in her lap. "You wanted to speak with me, Mr. Sinclair?" Robert sat across from her, his gaze steady but searching. For a moment, he didn't speak, as though he were weighing his words carefully. Finally, he said, "I found the source of the betrayal." Grace felt her chest tighten, though her expression didn't waver. "And it wasn't you," he said simply. Relief washed over her, but she didn't let it show. Instead, she inclined her head slightly. "I never expected it to be." Robert's lips quirked in a faint smile, though it held no humor. "Of course you didn't. You've always been one step ahead, haven't you?" "Not ahead, sir," she replied evenly. "Just prepared." His smile faded, and he leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. "It was Jordan, my closest advisor, the man I've trusted with more than anyone else. He's been feeding information to Cartwright for months." Grace remained silent, letting his words settle between them. She had suspected Jordan for some time, but had kept her thoughts to herself, knowing that accusations without proof would only add fuel to the fire. Robert exhaled heavily, running a hand through his hair. It's strange, isn't it? How easily trust can be broken. You think you know someone, and then he broke off, shaking his head. It makes you question everything. Not everything, Grace said quietly. He looked at her, his expression softening. No, not everything. The conversation shifted, the tension giving way to a quieter, more reflective tone. For the first time, Robert seemed willing to lower his guard, to allow a glimpse of the man behind the carefully constructed facade. You've been with this household for years, Grace, he said, through more than I care to admit. And yet, you've never wavered. Why? Grace met his gaze, her voice calm but firm. Because loyalty isn't just about the person you serve, Mr. Sinclair. It's about the values you uphold. This household has given me stability, purpose. That's something worth standing by, even when it's difficult. Her words seemed to strike a chord. Robert leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. You've always been honest with me, haven't you? I have, she replied without hesitation. And I've been less than kind, he admitted, his voice quieter now. I've pushed you, tested you. Sometimes, I think I did it just to see if you'd break. Grace's gaze didn't waver. And yet, here I am. A faint smile crossed his lips, though it was tinged with regret. Yes, here you are. The conversation turned to the future, to what would come next for the household in the wake of Jordan's betrayal. Robert spoke of changes he wanted to make, of lessons he had learned. And for the first time, Grace saw a glimmer of the man Eleanor had once described, a man capable of growth, of redemption. As the morning wore on, their conversation drew to a close. Robert stood and extended a hand toward Grace, his expression earnest. Thank you, Grace, for everything. She rose and shook his hand, her grip firm. You're welcome, Mr. Sinclair. As she turned to leave, he stopped her with a final question. Will you stay? Here, in this household? Grace paused, her hand on the doorframe. She turned back to him, her expression thoughtful. That depends. On what? He asked, his tone curious. On whether you truly mean to change, she said. Not for me, or for this household, but for yourself. Robert nodded slowly, understanding the weight of her words. I'll do my best. That's all anyone can ask, she replied, and with that, she left the room. Later that day, as Grace stood in the garden, the sun warm on her face, she allowed herself a moment of quiet reflection. The past few days had been a storm, but the air felt clearer now, the path ahead more certain. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew one thing. She had faced the storm and emerged stronger for it. And as she looked out over the neatly trimmed hedges and blooming flowers, she felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. The mansion, for all its grandeur and flaws, was still a place where she could make a difference. And for now, that was enough.